We're doing lesson 9.3. We are solving quadratic equations using square roots. Now, we have already been solving quadratic equations. We actually solved them back in chapter 8 when we factored, and then we solved the equation. Last night, you learned how to solve quadratic functions by graphing. But I want you to think back to what we've been doing so far. Every single time that you have solved a quadratic function, what have you been finding? You've been finding the x-intercepts, also known as the zeros. All right? So today we're going to continue to solve quadratic equations. But I'm going to teach you a new method today. Today we're going to learn how to solve using square roots. Now, before we get into that, you also learned last night that there is one solution, two solutions, or no solutions possible. So that means your graph could cross the x-axis twice. It could cross the x-axis once, or it could cross the x-axis not at all. All right? So you're going to see that again today. But the very first thing that's important for you to see is in the essential question. It says, how can you determine the number of solutions of a quadratic equation of the form? I want you to take your highlighter and I want you to highlight this form, because there is something very, very important missing from this form that you've been used to seeing. Okay? What is a quadratic function in standard form? Can anybody raise your hand and tell me? Milani? So we've had f of x or 0 equals ax squared plus bx plus c. Now, what do you notice is missing from our formula or our form for today? The x term, okay? So the method that I'm about to teach you, this square root method, is only going to work if the x term is missing, or if there is an x squared term and a constant. The only way this works is if there's an x squared term and a constant. Now, let's review square roots. First of all real numbers have two square roots. You say, well, Ms. Johnson, you did not tell us this on Monday. Okay, and I'm going to tell you why I didn't tell you on Monday in just a couple minutes. But technically, all real numbers have two square roots. One of them is positive and one of them is negative. I'm going to prove it to you. If I were to give you the number 25 and I asked you to find the square root of 25, and I do want you to write this over to the side, what would you naturally tell me is the square root of 25? 5, okay? And I would agree with you, because 5 squared absolutely equals 25. But what if I were to tell you that negative 5 is also a square root of 25? Well, let's look at it. If I take negative 5 and I square it, notice I put the negative in parentheses because this is negative 5 times negative 5. What does that equal? Not negative 25. Positive. A negative times a negative is a positive. So once again, we get a positive 25. So this is why all real numbers actually have two square roots, a positive and a negative. Now, this is the symbol of a square root, and every single one of you are used to seeing this. Who can read that to me? The square root of 9. Now, this is what you learned and saw in 9.1, and this is what I want you to understand. In lesson 9.1, all of your original problems started with a radical in them. So the fact that we only gave one answer was not incorrect. And let me tell you why. When the radical is given to you in the original problem, they are technically asking you for just the positive square root of a number. Okay? And in this case, they are asking for the positive square root of 9. And so that's why on Monday we kept just giving one answer, because the radical was already in the problem for us. Now, one last piece of information here, radical expressions. Any problem with a radical sign in it. And you learned that also back in 9.1. Now, let's talk about different ways to read square roots. First of all, we just read this one on the last screen. Everybody together, how would we read that? The square root of 9. Very good. All right. Who wants to give letter B a try? Liz? I'm okay with the negative square root of 9, although technically this is the opposite of the square root of 9. All right? Somebody raise your hand and read letter C to me. Anybody know how to read letter C? Positive or negative square root of 9. Now, if you do not know that, and even if you do, I want everybody to write it in their notes, okay? This is positive or negative. You read this as the positive or negative square root of 9. And that symbol is going to be very, very important in our lesson today. So very good. Positive or negative square root of 9. That's two separate numbers. Now, the very last one, letter D. Anybody want to take a stab at that one? Lily. The square root of negative 9. Does that cause anyone to stop and think for just a second? Okay, are we allowed to do the square root of a negative number? No. Okay, now some of you are hesitating. It's probably because there is a time when we can do a number that's negative under the radical. But what does the root have to be in order for that to work? No. An odd root. This is the square root of negative 9. So anytime you see the square root of a negative number, you're going to find out, you're going to remember that it's not a solution. There is no solution. All right? Now, look at these possible solutions. You learned about this last night. It is possible to have 2 x-intercepts, 1 x-intercept, or no x-intercepts. And those are your solutions. So I want you to take your highlighter, and I want you to highlight a few things. When D is greater than 0, when D is equal to 0, and when D is less than 0. These are the 3 situations that we're dealing with, okay? Now, you say, well, what is D? All right, well, look at the little formula that I've given you here. When x squared equals D, so in just a minute, we're going to work problems, and we're going to isolate the x squared. When x squared is set equal to a number that is greater than 0, that's a positive number, we're going to have 2 real solutions. So I want you to highlight the 2. When we isolate x squared here in a minute, and the D is equal to 0, we're going to have 1 real solution. So I want you to highlight the 1. And in just a second, when we isolate x squared, and it equals a number that is less than 0. Now help me out. If a number is less than 0, what kind of number is it? Negative. And if you want to add that to your notes, that'd be a great note to add as well. But when x squared is isolated and set equal to a number that is less than 0, you are going to have no solutions at all. Okay? Now let's take all this information and let's actually work a problem. It says solve the equation using square roots. And we're going to come back to that little piece of information under the directions here in just a minute. Now I want you to look at letter A. When we solve equations, what are we ultimately trying to get by itself? X, okay? But we can't start by getting x by itself because there's not an x in this problem. So what are we going to have to isolate first? What do you have in the problem? If you don't have an x term in the problem, you can't isolate x. But what do we have in the problem that we could isolate? The x squared. So our first goal is to isolate the x squared. Now this is basic algebra. How do we get x squared by itself? Move the negative 3 by dividing it. Very good. Okay, the negative 3 is keeping x squared from being alone, so we are going to move it to the other side with an inverse operation. So we're going to divide 3 from both sides. So we have x squared equals, what is negative 75 divided by negative 3? 25. Now I want us to stop for a second, and I want us to look right here. Now this is one of those pieces of information I'm not going to look for on homework, quizzes, and tests, but I do want it in your notes. Okay, this is the situation that's in that chart. So look back up at that chart in your notes. X squared by itself, and it is set equal to a number that is greater than 0, equal to 0, or less than 0. Greater than. So how many solutions should we end up with? 2. So we're going to make that little note right there. When we're finished, we should have 2 solutions. Now, we still have to get x by itself. So how do we undo something that has been squared? We square root it. So the next step is to take the square root of both sides. Now, we have just put the radical into the problem. You say, what do you mean? Was there a radical in the original problem? No. So guess what? When we put the radical into the problem, we also have to put this little plus or minus symbol. Because remember, every real number has 2 roots. So when we put the radical into the problem, we also have to put the plus or minus symbol in there. Now, what's the square root of x squared? X, and it equals plus or minus, what's the square root of 25? There you go. That's your final answer. Now, I do have some people who like to write these separate. So x equals negative 5, comma 5. I'm okay with that too. But you have to understand that is 2 answers right there. That is a positive 5 and that is a negative 5. Now, were we supposed to have 2 solutions at the end? We were, and we do. But we only have 2 solutions because when we put the radical into the problem, we also put the plus or minus sign. So whatever you've got to do, if you need to highlight this right here, if you need to make yourself a note, whatever you need to do, do it. When you put the radical into the problem, you also put the plus or minus sign in front of your answer. Get letter B. Again, our first goal is to get what by itself? The x squared. So what do we have to move in order to get x squared by itself?
4.
Be careful. Good. Don't call me after midnight. Says we have to add or subtract before we can multiply or divide. So we absolutely are going to have to add 15 to both sides. So we have 4x squared equals, what is negative 15 plus 15? 0. Are we finished? No, because what do we do next to get x squared by itself? We're going to divide both sides by 4. So x squared equals 0. Now let's stop for a second. Again, this is for our notes. We have x squared isolated and it's equal to 0. So how many solutions are we going to end up with? One solution. All right, let's keep going. How do we finish solving for x? Good. Got to take the square root of both sides. Now, we put the radical into the problem, which means we also have to put the what? The little plus or minus sign. What's the square root of x squared? And what's the square root of 0? Now, if I bring that little plus or minus sign down, is there any such thing as a positive 0 or a negative 0? No. So that symbol goes away, and there is our one solution. Were we supposed to have one solution? Yes, we were. All right, letter C. Now this one's a little bit trickier. We're still trying to isolate what first? Do you see an x squared? You sure? Yeah, right here is an x and right here is a square. So let's talk about some possibilities. What do you think we have to do first to solve this? Connor?
We can add the negative 3 inside to both sides to get it out of it.
We can't do that because it's in the parentheses with an x. That's a good thought though. Milani? Okay, we could distribute, except for the fact that before we distribute, we would have to do the shortcut. This is a binomial that's been squared. So we'd have to do a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. Now listen, that's a whole lot of work that just isn't necessary. So what if we just, instead of trying to isolate x squared, what if we just tried to isolate the whole piece that is squared? Okay, the binomial that is squared, what if we isolated that first? How would we do that? Divide both sides by 4. Because if we divide both sides by 4, now we have the binomial squared, and it equals 9/4. So what you guys were saying wasn't wrong, but it would have created a whole lot of extra work that wasn't necessary. Now, how do we undo something that's been squared? Square root it. And if we wanted to stop right here for just a second, the squared piece is equal to something greater than 0, equal to 0, or less than 0. Greater. So how many answers should we have? 2 solutions at the end. Okay, now back to my last question. What do you do to undo something that is squared?
Square root it.
Square root it. So we have x minus 3, and that's squared. We're going to take the square root of that side, and we're going to take the square root of 9/4. Now, what else do we have to put in the problem? Plus or minus. We put the radical in, so we got to put the plus or minus in. Okay, what do you think the square root of x minus 3 squared is? There you go. When you square root something that has been squared, you get the something. So the square root of x minus 3 squared is simply x minus 3. The square root of x minus 3 squared is just x minus 3, and then plus or minus. Yes, let's go ahead and separate, because we have a fraction under the radical. Let's separate the numerator, and let's separate the denominator. All right? Now, you guys keep working down. I'm going to have to move this over here to the side. But we have x minus 3 equals plus or minus. What's the square root of 9? 3. And what is the square root of 4? 2. Okay? Now, are we finished? No, not yet, because x is still not by itself. How are we going to get x by itself? We're going to add 3 to both sides. Now, this is where I lose people sometimes, okay? Because what people don't recognize is that is a positive 3/2 and a negative 3/2. So how many problems are we working out here? 2. All right? So here's what I want you to do. Again, just for the sake of the notes, I want you to do x equals 3/2 plus 3. And then I want you to do x equals negative 3/2 plus 3. Now, we still should not need a calculator here. What is 3/2 if we were to make it a mixed number? 1/2. 1 1/2. Not 1/2. 1 1/2. Okay, what's 1.5 plus 3? 4.5. So if we put that back as an improper fraction, we have 9 halves. Now, that negative 3 halves is technically a negative 1.5. So what is negative 1.5 plus 3? Let me ask you this. Are the signs the same or different?
Different.
So are you going to be adding the numbers or subtracting them? So what's 3 minus 1.5? 1.5. Okay? 3 minus 1.5 is 1.5 or 3 halves. All right? Because remember, we like to leave our answers as improper fractions. But there are your 2 solutions. Were we supposed to have 2 solutions? We were. And that's how we got them. So please don't forget the little plus or minus creates 2 separate problems that have to be worked out. Now, look at letter D. What would you do first for letter D? Subtract 12 from both sides. So we have x squared equals negative 2. Now, x squared is isolated. It's set equal to something less than 0. So how many solutions are we supposed to have? No solution. All right, so let's see if that's what happens. How do we solve for x? Square root both sides. So we have the square root of x squared equals the square root of negative 2. Now, I'm not even going to waste my time plugging in that little plus or minus because what do I notice? I have a what under the radical? Can I do a negative square root? Nope. So what is my final answer? No solution. Now, let me just tell you, okay? I know we always show a little bit of extra work in our notes. If you recognize right here that there's going to be no solution, I am absolutely fine if you skip this step. Okay? If once you have x squared isolated, you see that it's equal to a negative number and you can go straight to no solution, feel free to go there. Now, our second example says solve the equation using square roots. So the same method, but now it says round your solution to the nearest hundredth. Now, this is the key that the calculator is okay. So when you see that the example has asked you to round your answer, this is where they don't want exact answers. They're not asking you to do upside down division. They are allowing you to do the work in the calculator. So go ahead and grab your calculator and let's solve the equation. First thing we're going to do in letter A is what? Subtract 8 from both sides. Very good. So we have x squared equals 11. Now, at this point right here, how many solutions should we have? That's x squared equal to a number greater than 0. So that is 2 solutions. How do we finish solving for x? Square root. So we're going to square root both sides. Now, again, we put the radical in. What else goes in? The positive or negative. So the square root of x squared is x. And this becomes an approximate symbol because these are not exact answers. So we're going to put, it looks like an equal sign, but they're squiggly marks, okay? So approximately, go ahead and bring down the plus or minus. Now, if you have the right kind of calculator, here's how you do it. You hit the second or the shift button. Then you hit your x squared button because above that is the radical. Then you hit 11. Now, they have asked us to round to the nearest hundredth. So how many decimal places is that? 2. And if you don't remember that, that might be a good little thing to add in your notes. Okay? This is 2, left out decimal, 2 decimal places. So when you give me the numbers in your calculator in just a sec, I want you to give me 3 decimal places to start with. All right? What shows up on your calculator when you do the square root of 11?
3.316.
All right? Now, if we're supposed to round to the nearest hundredth, we said that's 2 decimal places. What number's in the hundredths place? 1. And so this is just a little review in rounding. We look at the number to the right, and it's a 6. So what does that tell us to do with the 1? Go up. So this is going to become positive or negative 3 and 32 hundredths as your final answer. Did you do first for letter B? All right, we add 2 to both sides, so 5x squared equals 2. What'd you do next? Divide both sides by 5, so x squared equals 2/5. Now, based on what x squared is equal to, how many solutions should we end up with? 2. Once again, x squared is equal to a number greater than 0, so that is going to be 2 solutions. How do I solve for x? Square root both sides. I put the radical in, so what else do I put in? A little plus or minus symbol and the square root of x squared. And we're going to do approximately, because we're rounding, plus or minus. Now again, if you have the same calculator as I do, you have to hit the second button. You have to hit the x squared button because that's where the radical is. Then you have to do the fraction bar. If you see that little button that says A and then a little B/C, that's going to give you your fraction bar. So you hit that, then you put the denominator of 5 in, close your parenthesis, and hit equal. And what do you get?
0.63.
Give me 3 decimal places again. All right. Now, we're rounding to the second decimal place, so what number's in the second decimal place? The hundredths. The 3. We look at the 2, and what does the 2 tell us?
Go down.
Do you go down or do you leave it at 3? Leave it at 3, all right? So your final answer is x is approximately equal to positive or negative 63 hundredths. And that is lesson 9.3.